My parents thought a glass of drugged champagne and a public humiliation would teach me a lesson in gratitude. They threw me out of the Sterling mansion with nothing but the clothes on my back. 5 years later, I sit across from them as the mystery creditor holding the life of their company in my hands. They have no idea that the daughter they called a Leech is about to swallow their pride whole. My name is Elena Sterling, and 5 years ago, I stood on the manicured lawn of my family's Hamptons estate wearing a smile that felt like it was stapled to my face. The air smelled of salt water and old money. My parents had spent over $200,000 on this party, ostensibly to celebrate my graduation. But in reality, it was just another networking event for Sterling Corp. I adjusted the silk of my dress, feeling like an imposter in my own skin. They thought I had graduated with a degree in law, ready to take my place as a silent partner in their legal battles. They did not know I had spent every night for 4 years studying software engineering and global logistics, building algorithms instead of writing briefs. My father, Richard Sterling, found me near the ice sculpture. He looked at me with that familiar mix of disappointment and disdain. He swirled his scotch, his eyes scanning the crowd for someone more important. "Stop fidgeting!" he snapped, his voice low so the senator nearby would not hear. "You look nervous. A Sterling never looks nervous. Your sister never looked nervous. She was perfect." She isn't here, Father," I stammered, the ghost of my missing sister always hovering between us. "Exactly," he said, turning his back on me. "And we are stuck with the spare." I felt the sting of tears, but forced them back. That was when my mother, Victoria, glided over. She was a vision in emerald silk, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. She held out a crystal flute of champagne, the bubbles rising in a frantic dance. "A drink up. Elena," she said, her voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "To your future, we are so proud." I took the glass, desperate for any sign of affection. I took a long sip. It tasted bitter, but I swallowed it down, forcing a smile. My mother leaned in to kiss my cheek, her grip on my arm tightening like a vice. "You are just a leech clinging to this family's name," she whispered into my ear, her tone dripping with venom. "Enjoy the last drop." I pulled back, shocked, but she was already ushering me toward the stage. The spotlight hit me, blinding and hot. I stepped up to the microphone to give my thank you speech. "I would like to thank—" I started, but the words felt thick in my mouth. Suddenly, the horizon tilted. My legs turned to rubber. A wave of nausea crashed over me, violent and immediate. The faces in the crowd began to melt into a grotesque smear of colors. I grabbed the podium for support, knocking over a vase of flowers. It shattered with a sound like a gunshot. I tried to speak, to say I was sick, but only a garbled moan came out. To the hundreds of elites watching, I did not look sick. I looked wasted. I collapsed to my knees, drooling, my limbs twitching uncontrollably. Through the haze, I saw my parents rushing onto the stage, but they did not check my pulse. They did not call for a doctor. "I am so sorry," my father bellowed to the crowd, his voice trembling with feigned heartbreak. "We have tried everything. Rehab, therapy. She just won't stop. Get her out of here," my mother shrieked at the security team, tears streaming down her face in a performance worthy of an Oscar. "Don't let her ruin this night for everyone else." 2 massive guards hauled me up. I tried to protest, to say, "Mom, help me," but my tongue was paralyzed. They dragged me through the kitchen and out the back service entrance. The cold night air hit me as they threw me onto the wet asphalt of the delivery driveway. My suitcase, packed earlier that day by the maids under orders I had not understood until now, landed hard beside me, spilling clothes into the mud. "Mr. Sterling says don't come back," one guard said, cutting my credit cards in half with a pair of shears right in front of my face before tossing the plastic shards at me. "You are trespassing if you step on the property again." The heavy iron gate slammed shut. I lay there in the pouring rain, the paralysis slowly fading into shivering agony. I watched the warm lights of the mansion, heard the distant music resume. It was not a mistake. It was not a misunderstanding. As the cold seeped into my bones, the realization hit me harder than the pavement had. They had not just kicked me out. They had staged my social execution. They drugged me to make me look like a liability so they could cut me loose without damaging their reputation. I was not a daughter to them. I was a written-off asset. 5 years later, the rain in Seattle felt different than the cold downpour in the Hamptons. It felt like fuel. I sat behind the wheel of my rusted 1998 Ford pickup truck, listening to the engine wheeze as I parked in front of a weathered brick building in the Capitol Hill district. My neighbors knew me as the quiet girl in apartment 4B who always wore oversized hoodies and drove a vehicle that sounded like a dying tractor. They assumed I was a struggling freelancer, scraping by on graphic design gigs. They had no idea that the woman buying day-old bread at the bakery was the majority shareholder and anonymous CEO of Nexus Flow. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my studio apartment. It was small, barely 500 square feet, but it was mine. I unlocked the door and stepped into the only luxury I allowed myself, which was a state-of-the-art server rack humming quietly in the closet. Nexus Flow was currently valued at over $3 billion. We provided artificial intelligence solutions that optimize global supply chains, predicting disruptions before they happened. I was the ghost in the machine, the invisible architect behind the logistics of 60% of the Fortune 500 companies. It had not been an easy climb. I remembered the first year after the expulsion. I lived out of a motel room that smelled of mildew, eating 40-cent ramen packets for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I spent 20 hours a day at the public library, coding on a refurbished laptop until my eyes burned and my fingers cramped. The breakthrough happened when my algorithm saved a national retail giant $50 million in shipping costs during a holiday blizzard. That contract changed everything, but I never stepped into the light. I hired a team of aggressive legal proxies to handle the face-to-face meetings. I took a salary of $40,000 a year to cover my rent and food, reinvesting every other cent back into the company. Money was power, but anonymity was freedom. I threw my keys on the counter and checked the time. It was 8 a.m. I had a board meeting with our directors in Tokyo in 10 minutes. I sat down at my desk, which was just a folding table, and put on my headset. The voice modulation software I used deepened my tone slightly, stripping away any gender or age identifiers. The Asian market expansion is proceeding ahead of schedule, I said, my voice projecting authority that terrified seasoned executives. Cut the overhead in the Singapore distribution center by 12%. Do it by Monday. After the meeting ended, I leaned back and rubbed my temples. I was about to head out for a discounted coffee when my personal burner phone buzzed. It was a number I had not seen in years, belonging to an old college friend of my mother who had always had a soft spot for gossip. I thought you should know, the text read. The Sterling Group is imploding. It is all over the Whisper network. A cold smirk touched my lips. I felt a surge of curiosity mixed with a dark, satisfying sense of vindication. I turned back to my monitors. I did not need gossip. I had Nexus Flow. I began typing furiously, bypassing the public news feeds and diving straight into the dark pools of financial data where the real truth lived. My fingers danced across the keyboard as I deployed my custom crawlers to scrape the Sterling Group's internal logistics and payment history. The data flooded my screen in streams of red. It was worse than I thought. My parents were not just struggling, they were drowning. Unbelievable, I whispered to the empty room. You greedy fools! The analysis showed that the Sterling Group had been functionally insolvent for 24 months. To keep up appearances, my parents had been shifting debt between shell companies, inflating asset values, and falsifying quarterly reports. They were burning through cash at a rate of $2 million a month just to maintain their country club memberships and the facade of success. They were committing massive financial fraud, a Ponzi scheme built on their own legacy. They were one audit away from prison, and they were still throwing parties, oblivious to the fact that the floor had already fallen out from under them. I cracked my knuckles and initialized the deep dive protocol on my monitors. The glow of the screens illuminated my small apartment as I breached the firewall of the Sterling Group's private accounting firm. It took less than 10 minutes to bypass their outdated security. What I found inside made the rain outside seem warm by comparison. The financial rot was not recent. It was a festering wound that had been gangrenous for 2 years. My father, the man who prided himself on his business acumen, had bet the company's liquidity on a speculative bubble of virtual real estate and non-fungible tokens right before the market crashed. The balance sheets were a sea of red ink. They had lost over $300 million in a single quarter. To cover the gaping hole, they had secretly mortgaged the Hamptons estate, not once, but 3 times. The prestigious art collection, including the Monet that hung in the foyer, had been quietly auctioned off to private buyers in Geneva. Yet, the dates of these sales coincided perfectly with the $50,000 per plate charity galas they continued to host. They were effectively lighting money on fire to keep the shareholders blinded by the smoke. Then, a specific file caught my eye. Tagged with a high-priority alert, I opened it and felt the air leave my lungs. "Leo!" I breathed out. My little brother's name was plastered across 6 high-risk loan agreements. He was only 23 years old. When I left, he was a gentle 18-year-old who loved painting and hated conflict. Now, according to these documents, he was the primary guarantor for loans totaling nearly $800,000. I read the terms and felt bile rise in my throat. These were not standard bank loans. They were predatory agreements with interest rates climbing nearly 30%. My parents, having exhausted their own credit lines and blackened their names with major banks, had turned to their own son. They must have manipulated him, using his loyalty and naivety against him. I could almost hear my mother's voice, tearful and pleading, telling him it was just a formality to save the family legacy. They had used him as a pristine vessel to carry their toxic debt. I quickly cross-referenced Leo's social security number to find his current employment. He was not working at the family firm. He was a junior broker at a bottom-tier firm in Queens, logging 70-hour weeks. His annual salary was $45,000. It was barely enough to survive in the city, let alone service the interest on nearly $1 million of debt. I found a digital footprint of his personal life. He was married to a woman named Clara. Her social media was full of optimistic posts about their humble beginnings, clearly unaware that her husband was drowning. Leo was hiding this from her. He was carrying the weight of the Sterling Empire's collapse on his back, working himself to the bone, terrified and alone. A cold, sharp fury replaced my shock. My parents had exiled me. Yes, but they were doing something far worse to Leo. They were cannibalizing him. They were eating their own young to sustain their delusions of grandeur for just a few more months. They were willing to crush his future, his marriage, and his sanity, just so they did not have to admit they were failures. "Not anymore," I said, my voice shaking with the intensity of my anger. "You do not get to destroy him too." I switched windows, bringing up the Nexus Flow acquisition interface. I was done watching from the sidelines. It was time to intervene, but not as a sister. If I approached them as Elena, they would just gaslight me or beg for money that they would inevitably squander. I needed to approach them as a force of nature. "Initiate Protocol Vulture," I commanded the system. "Identify all outstanding debt obligations of the Sterling Group and Leo Sterling held by third-party lenders." The screen populated with a list of creditors. "Buy them," I said, my finger hovering over the enter key. "Use the shell companies in the Cayman Islands. Offer the lenders 60 cents on the dollar for immediate buyout. They know this debt is toxic. They will be desperate to sell. Estimated capital requirement is $42 million. The system displayed. "Confirm transaction." "Confirm," I said, pressing the key with a definitive click. I watched the progress bars fill up green. One by one, the debts transferred ownership. By tomorrow morning, the bank that owned their mortgage, the private equity sharks holding Leo's loans, and the vendors they hadn't paid in 6 months would all answer to one entity. Me? I was no longer just their discarded daughter. I was the owner of their debts, the holder of their leash, and the ghost coming back to haunt the house they had built on lies. I waited for him in the back booth of Benny's Burger Joint, a greasy diner in Queens with cracked vinyl seats and a smell of burnt coffee that hung heavy in the air. This was where we used to sneak away to when we were teenagers, pretending to be normal kids while our driver waited blocks away. I wore a baseball cap pulled low and an old hoodie, blending in with the late-night crowd of shift workers. I needed Leo to think I was still the struggling artist, the black sheep who had nothing to give but a listening ear. When the bell above the door chimed, my heart broke. Leo walked in, but the vibrant, laughing boy I remembered was gone. In his place stood a man who looked decades older than 23. His cheap suit was wrinkled and stained at the cuffs, hanging loosely on his frame as if he had lost 20 pounds. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises in the harsh fluorescent light. He scanned the room with the jumpy anxiety of a hunted animal. "Leo!" I called out softly. He froze, his eyes locking onto mine. For a second, I saw relief, but it was instantly replaced by terror. He rushed over and slid into the booth, keeping his head down. "Elle," he breathed, reaching across the table to grip my hands. His palms were rough and calloused, not the hands of a stockbroker. You shouldn't be here. You have to go. If they find out I am talking to you. God, Elle, please go." "I am not going anywhere," I said, squeezing his hands tight. "I heard you're in trouble. Talk to me." He tried to pull away, shaking his head. "You can't help. I know. I know you're struggling too. I don't want to drag you down with me." I ordered him a coffee and a grilled cheese sandwich. He ate it with a ravenous hunger that made my stomach turn. Between bites, the truth started to spill out, messy and painful. "I am drowning. Elle?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I tell Claire I get bonuses at work. I tell her the market is good, but it's a lie. I work the day shift at the brokerage, and then I go to a warehouse in Brooklyn. I load trucks from 8 at night until 2 in the morning." I stared at him, horrified. My brother, the gentle artist, breaking his back, hauling cargo to fund our parents' delusions. "Why?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Because they need it," Leo said, tears welling in his eyes. "Mom calls me crying every day. She says the creditors are at the door. She says the stress is killing Dad. I send them everything. Elle, every extra cent." He paused, looking down at his lap. "Clara's 7 months pregnant." The air left my lungs. "You are having a baby." "She is having complications," he choked out. "The doctor said she is at risk for preeclampsia. She needs to be on bed rest. She needs to be in a good hospital if she goes into labor early. But I can't afford the deposit for the private wing. I can barely make rent." He fumbled for his phone and shoved it across the table. "Look at this. This came this morning." I read the message on the cracked screen. It was from our father. "If you don't send $10,000 by Friday, we will lose the house. Do you want to see your mother on the street? You are an ungrateful son after everything we sacrificed for you." Rage, hot and blinding, surged through my veins. It was not enough that they had discarded me. They were now actively draining the life out of Leo. They knew his wife was pregnant. They knew he was struggling. Yet they were demanding $10,000 to maintain a mansion they had no right to live in, threatening him with guilt while he worked himself to death. They had crossed the line from selfish to monstrous. "Leo," I said, my voice steady and hard, "listen to me. I am going to help you." "You can't," he said, wiping his eyes. "You don't have that kind of money." "I have ways." I lied, knowing I couldn't reveal my identity yet. It would be too much for him to process, and he might tell them in a moment of weakness. "But you have to promise me something. You cannot tell them you saw me." "You cannot tell them I'm helping. Promise me." I promise." He stammered. But Elle, please don't do anything stupid. Don't get into debt for me. I looked at my brother, beaten down by the people who were supposed to protect him. I wasn't just going to pay his debt, bah. I was going to burn the system that enslaved him to the ground. I won't, I said, signaling for the check. Go home to Clara. Tell her everything's going to be okay. As I watched him walk away into the night, shoulders hunched against the wind, I pulled out my secure phone. The time for observation was over. It was time to execute. 2 days later, my phone screamed to life just as I was reviewing a quarterly projection. It was Leo. His voice was a jagged shard of panic that cut straight through me. Elena, it's Clara. She fell. There was blood. We are at City General. Please, I don't know what to do. I dropped everything. I grabbed my keys and sprinted to my truck, tearing through the rainy streets of Seattle with a reckless disregard for speed limits. When I arrived at City General, the scene was a chaotic nightmare of underfunded public health care. The waiting room smelled of stale coffee and antiseptic, packed with people coughing and crying. I found Leo standing outside the emergency triage doors, looking like he was about to shatter into a million pieces. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering. A harried-looking doctor in scrubs with dark sweat stains on his back stepped out to speak to him. I slowed down, hugging the wall near a vending machine to listen without intruding on the medical privacy, pulling my hood up to obscure my face. Mr. Sterling, the doctor said, his voice grave. Your wife has suffered a placental abruption. Both she and the baby are in critical distress. We need to perform an emergency C-section immediately, but our NICU is at full capacity and we don't have the specialized equipment for a baby born at 7 months with this level of trauma. Do whatever you have to do, Leo screamed. Save them! We need to transfer her to the private specialty wing at St. Jude's, the doctor explained rapidly. But your insurance doesn't cover that facility. The hospital administrator requires an upfront deposit of $50,000 before they will authorize the ambulance transfer and prep the surgical team. It is policy. I am sorry, but I need that payment now. $50,000. Leo looked as if he had been shot. He didn't have $50, let alone $50,000. I can get it, Leo stammered, his hands fumbling for his phone. My parents. They have money. They will help. I watched from the shadows as he dialed. I could hear him begging, his voice cracking with humiliation. Dad, please. It's Clara. She might die. I need the money back. Just a loan. Please. There was a pause, and then Leo pulled the phone away, staring at it in disbelief. They are coming, he whispered to the air. They are coming. 10 minutes later, Richard and Victoria Sterling swept into the crowded waiting room like royalty entering a slum. They were dressed in immaculate evening wear, clearly on their way to a high society event. People stared at them, but they looked at the sick and injured around them with open disgust. They did not rush to Leo with open arms. They marched up to him with irritation etched into their features. What is the meaning of this hysteria? My father, Richard, demanded, checking his gold watch. We are due at a dinner with a potential investor for the company in an hour. This is incredibly inconvenient. Leo? Dad, she needs surgery, Leo cried, pointing to the doors. They need $50,000 or they won't operate. Please, I sent you nearly that much over the last year. I just need it back to save my wife and daughter. My mother. Victoria wrinkled her nose. She glanced at the doors where Clara was fighting for her life, but her eyes were cold, devoid of any grandmotherly concern. Keep your voice down, she hissed, looking around nervously. Do you want someone to film this? Do you want the Seattle Times to run a headline about the Sterling family in a public hospital brawling over money? It would be a PR disaster. A PR disaster, Leo choked out. Mom, Clara's dying. We don't have $50,000 sitting around for unplanned emergencies, Richard snapped, adjusting his silk tie. We are liquid right now. Why didn't you tell your wife to be more careful walking around clumsily at 7 months? This is negligence on her part. You won't help, Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper. We can't help people who refuse to help themselves, Richard said, using the same arrogant tone he had used on me 5 years ago. Let this be a lesson in financial responsibility. Leo, you made your bed. Leo's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees on the dirty linoleum floor, sobbing into his hands, begging forgiveness from a wife who couldn't hear him. My parents stood over him, not offering a hand, but checking their reflections in the glass of the nurse's station, annoyed that their evening schedule had been disrupted. From my spot in the corner, I felt a physical pain in my chest. It wasn't sadness. It was the sensation of the last thread of attachment to these people snapping. They were not just bad parents. They were monsters. I dug my fingernails into my palms so hard that I felt skin break. They had signed their own warrant. I took a deep breath, adjusted my jacket, and prepared to step out of the darkness. The monitor inside the triage bay let out a long, piercing wail that sounded like death itself. A nurse burst through the double doors, her face flushed with panic. She looked straight at the administrator behind the glass partition. Her blood pressure is bottoming out, the nurse shouted. We need to move her now, or we lose the heartbeat. Do we have the transfer authorization, or do I send her to county? I still need the $50,000 deposit, the administrator said, looking apologetically at Leo. I cannot override the system. Leo let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, clutching his hair. My father, Richard, rolled his eyes and checked his watch again, muttering about how this drama was going to make them late for appetizers. That was the moment the last ember of my childhood affection for them died. I stepped out of the shadows. I did not walk like the beaten-down girl they had thrown out into the rain 5 years ago. I walked with the stride of a woman who moved markets with a single email. I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out a card. It was not plastic. It was solid titanium, anodized black, invitation only. I slapped it onto the laminate counter of the reception desk. The heavy metallic clatter silenced the entire room. Charge the maximum limit, I said, my voice cutting through the noise like a scalpel. I want the VIP trauma package at St. Jude's. Get the chief of surgery on the line right now and tell him to scrub in. I am not paying for residence. The administrator blinked, stunned by the sudden command. She looked at the card, then up at me, her eyes widening as she recognized the insignia of the Centurion Bank. Yes, ma'am, she stammered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Who should I bill this to? Elena Vance, I said clearly. My parent, who had been whispering angrily to each other near the exit, froze. They turned slowly. At first, there was zero recognition in their eyes. They saw a woman in a tailored Italian coat, radiating cold power and wealth. They saw a peer, perhaps a competitor. They did not see their daughter. To them, Elena Sterling was a failure in rags. This woman was a predator. Ms. Vance, the payment is cleared, the administrator said, her tone shifting to deferential respect. We are prepping the transport team. We have alerted the presidential suite at St. Jude's for recovery. Elena, my mother whispered. The word fell from her lips like a stone. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out tentatively, her eyes darting over my expensive clothes, my confident posture, the way the hospital staff was now scrambling to obey my orders. I ignored her completely. I turned to Leo, who was staring up at me from the floor, his mouth slightly open, tears drying on his cheeks. Stand up, Leo, I said gently. Go with your wife. Ride in the ambulance. Don't worry about the money. I have taken care of everything. Just make sure she knows you're there. Leo croaked, disbelief warring with relief in his eyes. How? Go, I commanded. He scrambled up, nodding frantically Pamerino, and ran through the doors as the medical team wheeled Clara out on a stretcher. As the chaos of the emergency transfer faded down the hallway, the silence in the waiting room became suffocating. I turned slowly on my heel to face the two people who had given me life, and then tried to destroy it. Richard and Victoria Sterling stood there, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. The arrogance was cracking, replaced by a confused, calculating look. My father was staring at the black card still sitting on the counter, his mind clearly racing. He knew that card required an annual spending limit that exceeded his entire company's current cash flow. The contempt in his eyes was vanishing, replaced by a dawn of horrifying realization and the greasy sheen of greed. They weren't looking at a daughter. They were looking at a bank account. "Elena," my father said, his voice trembling slightly as he tried to adopt a paternal tone. "Is that really you? You look different." "I am different," I said, picking up my card and slipping it back into my pocket. "I am the person who just did what you were too selfish to do." "Now, sweetheart," my mother began, putting on her fake socialite smile, though her eyes were terrified. "We were just caught off guard. We didn't know you had done so well for yourself." "Save it," I said. "The surgery has started. We have a long night ahead of us." Richard recovered his voice first, and true to form, he chose aggression over gratitude. He stepped toward me, his face reddening with a mix of indignation and suspicion. He pointed a shaking finger at the pocket where I had stashed the black titanium card. "Where did you steal that?" he demanded, his voice rising loud enough to echo in the sterile hallway. "There is no way a dropout like you has that kind of credit line legally. Who are you sleeping with? Or have you resorted to laundering money for cartels? Tell me right now before I call the police and have you arrested for fraud." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that stopped him in his tracks. I straightened my cuffs, looking at him with the detached pity one might feel for a dying insect. "You really have no idea, do you?" I said calmly. "You are currently begging for a meeting with a strategic partner to save your sinking ship. You have sent 12 emails to the CEO's office in the last week alone. You are standing in front of her." "What are you babbling about?" Richard spat. "I am the founder and majority shareholder of Nexus Flow," I stated. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Victoria let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back, her hand clutching the plastic chair in the waiting area to keep from falling. Her eyes went wide, darting between my face and my father's, connecting the dots between the rumors of the reclusive CEO and the daughter she had discarded. That is impossible," she whispered. "Nexus Flow is a unicorn startup. It is worth billions." $3.2 billion, as of the market close today, I corrected her. "And I know exactly where your money has gone. I know you coerced Leo into transferring $3,000 on the 4th of last month to cover your lease payments. I know you took another $5,000 on the 15th, forcing him to take a payday loan with a 20% interest rate. I have the bank logs, the routing numbers, and the text messages where you threatened to disown him if he did not pay up." Richard's face went from red to a ghostly pale. He licked his lips, his eyes shifting as his brain frantically tried to recalibrate. He realized he could not bully me anymore. So, he tried to charm me. He straightened his posture and forced a grotesque, terrifying smile onto his face. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping to a sickeningly sweet register. "Darling, you have to understand. We were hard on you, yes. But look at you now. You are a titan of industry. We did that. We pushed you to be independent. It was a test. Don't you see? We are so incredibly proud of you." "Proud," I repeated the word, tasting the bile in my throat. "Your pride tastes like the sedatives you slipped into my champagne 5 years ago. I remember the floor rushing up to meet me. I remember you apologizing for your junkie daughter while I lay paralyzed on the stage. I haven't forgotten a single second of that night." "That was necessary, tough love," Victoria interjected weakly. "We did it for the family." "And now I am doing this for the family," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I didn't just pay for Clara's surgery. As of an hour ago, Nexus Flow acquired the entirety of the Sterling Group's debt obligations, every mortgage, every business loan, every outstanding vendor payment. I own it all. They stared at me in horror. They realized the trap had already snapped shut. I was no longer their daughter. I was their landlord, their banker, and their executioner. Before they could stammer out another lie, the double doors swung open. The chief of surgery stepped out, pulling off his cap. "The mother and child are stable," he announced. "It was close, but your quick action saved them both. A healthy baby girl." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. I looked at my parents, who were opening their mouths to feign happiness. "Don't speak," I cut them off. "This conversation is not over, but I will not conduct business in a hospital corridor. You will report to the main conference room at Nexus Flow headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Do not be late." I turned my back on them and walked toward the recovery ward, leaving them standing in the hallway, looking small, old, and terrified. I stationed 2 armed private security guards outside the double doors of the maternity ward with strict instructions. They were to bar Richard and Victoria Sterling from entering, using physical force if necessary. The hospital administration, having received full payment and then some, was more than happy to accommodate my request for privacy. Inside the quiet hum of the neonatal unit, I stood next to Leo, looking down at the tiny, fragile life in the incubator. My niece was small, a tangle of tubes and monitors, but she was fighting. "You really think they would come back?" Leo asked, his voice hoarse from crying. "After what you said to them, they would come back to guilt you," I said softly, watching the baby's chest rise and fall. "They would come back to leverage this baby for a loan. I am not going to let that happen. We are cutting the infection out. Leo, tonight." "It feels cruel," he admitted, looking at his hands. "They are still mom and dad. They ceased being parents the moment they chose their reputation over your wife's life," I replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I have to be the monster so you can be the father. Let me handle the cruelty. You just focus on Clara and the baby." While I kept watch at the hospital, my network surveillance tools informed me of the chaos unraveling at the Sterling estate. I received notifications every time they attempted a transaction, desperate to flee the country or hide their assets before the meeting. My father tried to wire the remaining operating capital to an offshore account in Belize. The transaction was flagged and blocked instantly. My mother tried to list her jewelry collection on a private auction site, but my legal team had already filed emergency liens on every physical asset they owned. They were running through the halls of their mansion like rats on a sinking ship, only to find every lifeboat locked. They realized, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that they were completely powerless. The next morning, the sun broke over the Seattle skyline, but I felt no warmth, only the cold precision of the task ahead. I arrived at the Nexus Flow headquarters wearing a sharp charcoal suit that cost more than my first car. The security team nodded respectfully as I passed, and the employees I encountered in the elevator greeted me with a reverence bordering on fear. I was no longer the invisible coder in the basement. I was the architect of their success. I checked the security feed on my tablet. Richard and Victoria had arrived at 8:45 in the morning, 15 minutes early, desperate to make a good impression. I let them sit there. I gave strict orders to the reception staff to treat them like standard walk-in applicants. No coffee, no comfortable waiting room, no updates. They sat on the hard, modern benches in the main lobby for 2 agonizing hours, watching young professionals bustle past them, ignored by the very world they used to think they ruled. When I finally gave the signal at 11 o'clock, they were ushered into the executive boardroom. The room was all glass and steel, offering a panoramic view of the city they could no longer afford. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. Flanking me were 4 of the most aggressive corporate attorneys in the state. My parents looked exhausted. Their clothes were wrinkled from the previous day, and the bags under their eyes told me they had not slept. They hesitated at the door, intimidated by the phalanx of lawyers. "Sit," I commanded, not bothering to stand up. They sank into the chairs at the far end of the table, looking miles away from me. I didn't offer a greeting. I didn't ask how they were. I simply slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished wood. It stopped perfectly in front of my father. "What is this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "It is the end of the road," I said, leaning back in my chair and steepling my fingers. "Open it." The document is titled Transfer of Ownership and Relinquishment of Executive Power. You are going to sign it, or you are going to lose everything. I watched my father read the terms, his face turning a shade of purple that usually preceded a cardiac event. The document was not a negotiation, it was a surrender. Clause 1 stipulates the immediate transfer of 100% of your remaining equity in the Sterling Group to a blind trust with Leo Sterling as the sole beneficiary. I explained, my voice devoid of any warmth. I will act as the executor until he is ready to take the helm. Clause 2 removes you both from the board of directors. Effective immediately. You are permanently barred from holding any executive position or consultancy role within the company or its subsidiaries. And what exactly do we get for handing over our empire? My father spat, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. Freedom from debt, I replied smoothly. And a monthly stipend of $3,500. It is the median income for a retiree in this state. It will cover rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment, groceries, and basic utilities. There is no provision for a driver, private security, or country club dues. Richard stared at me as if I had spoken in tongues. The insult was too great for his ego to comprehend. He stood up so abruptly, his chair tipped over backward with a loud crash. He grabbed the heavy document and tore it in half, then tore the halves again, throwing the confetti of paper at my face. "I would rather die," he screamed, his spit flying across the mahogany table. "You think you can walk in here and steal my life's work? I built this. I am Richard Sterling. I will not live like a pauper because my ungrateful daughter decided to play dress up as a CEO. Get out! Get out of my building!" I did not flinch as the pieces of paper fluttered down around me. I simply nodded to the lawyer on my right, who calmly pulled a fresh, identical copy of the contract from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Then, I picked up a remote control and pressed a single button. The massive projection screen behind me hummed to life. It displayed a complex web of bank transfers, offshore accounts, and falsified tax returns. "This is not a negotiation. Richard," I said, dropping the formality of calling him father. "This is a mercy kill. What you see on the screen is evidence of tax evasion, wire fraud, and the embezzlement of $4 million from the Employee Pension Fund. My forensic accountants found this in less than 6 hours. Imagine what the FBI would find in a week." The room went deathly silent. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with terror. "If you sign the agreement," I continued, my voice hard as granite, "I will bury this evidence. I will classify it as an internal accounting error and cover the losses with my own capital. You retire quietly. You live a small, invisible life. But if you walk out of that door without signing, I will forward this entire file to the district attorney before you reach the elevator. You are looking at 20 years in federal prison. Do you think you will survive 20 years in a cell? Richard." "Elena, please," my mother wailed, finally finding her voice. She reached across the table, her perfectly manicured fingers grasping at air. "We are your family. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you. You cannot send your own parents to prison. Have some mercy. Where is the little girl who used to bake cookies with me?" I looked at her, and for a second, I felt a phantom ache in my chest. But then I remembered the cold rain on my skin. I remembered the sound of the gate slamming shut. "That little girl died the night you drugged her and threw her luggage into the mud," I said, my voice cutting through her sobs. "You didn't show mercy when I was paralyzed on that stage. You didn't show mercy when Leo begged you for help to save his dying wife. You do not get to appeal to a relationship you murdered 5 years ago." I pointed to the fresh contract. "Choose A small apartment in the suburbs, or a cage. You have 1 minute. Richard looked at the screen, then at me, and finally at the door. He looked for a way out, a loophole, a trick, but he found nothing but the cold, hard walls of the reality I had built around him. His shoulders collapsed. The titan of industry shrank into a defeated old man. He picked up the pen. His hand shook so violently that the tip scratched against the paper, but he signed. "It is done," he whispered, the sound of a man whose soul had just been crushed. "Good," I said, taking the document before the ink was even dry. "Now get out of my chair." As soon as the ink was dry on the paper, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to absolute finality. I did not offer them a handshake. I did not offer them a goodbye. I simply pressed the intercom button on the conference table. "Security," I said, my voice projecting clearly to the team waiting just outside. "Please escort the former chairpersons out of the building. They no longer have clearance for this floor or any Sterling Group property." 2 uniformed guards entered. My father, Richard, stood up, clutching his chest as if he were having palpitations, but nobody moved to help him. When they tried to walk past the reception desk with their heads held high, I stopped them. "Wait," I commanded. "The badges." I held out my hand. Slowly, with trembling fingers, my mother unclipped her access card. My father threw his on the desk. It was the final stripping of their identity. They were marched to the elevator and down to the lobby, not through the executive exit, but through the main revolving doors. I watched from the window as they stepped onto the busy sidewalk. There was no chauffeur waiting for them, no black town car. They stood confused on the concrete, looking left and right. 2 ordinary people in a world they had spent a lifetime looking down upon. They had to hail a yellow cab, vanishing into the traffic like smoke. I did not linger on their departure. My work there was done, but my real duty was waiting at St. Jude's Hospital. When I arrived, the room was quiet. Leo was sitting in the rocking chair, staring at his sleeping daughter. He looked up when I entered, his eyes red but clear for the first time in years. I walked over and placed a thick envelope on the nightstand next to the bassinet. "What is this?" Leo asked. "It is her birthright," I said softly. "I have restructured the entire company. The debt is gone. The toxic assets are liquidated. The Sterling Group is clean, and it belongs to you. I am putting it in a trust for her, with you as the acting CEO." Leo looked terrified. He shook his head. "Elle, I can't. I am not a shark like Dad. I don't know how to run an empire. I will crash it." "You won't," I assured him, kneeling beside the chair, "because you won't be doing it the way they did. You have empathy, you have a conscience, and you won't be alone. I am assigning a transition team from Nexus Flow to handle the logistics and the financials for the first 2 years. We will rebuild this company on ethics, not exploitation. You just be the leader they never were." Behind us, a rustle of sheets made us turn. Clara was awake. She looked pale, but the fear that had defined her expression for months was gone. Leo rushed to her side, explaining everything. When she realized they were free, that the crushing weight of the debt and the threats was gone, she broke down. It wasn't a cry of pain, but of pure, exhausting relief. "Would you like to hold her?" Clara asked me, her voice thick with emotion. I nodded. I picked up the bundle of blankets. My niece was warm and heavy in my arms. She opened her eyes, blinking against the light. Looking at her, I felt a connection snap into place, a bond that had nothing to do with blood obligation and everything to do with love. I had destroyed a fake family to build a real one. A month later, the business headlines were singing a different tune. The Wall Street Journal praised the humanitarian pivot of the Sterling Group. The stock price was stabilizing. My parents had quietly moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in a nondescript suburb in New Jersey. They had no social media presence, no gala invitations, and no audience. They were simply gone, erased from the world that had mattered so much to them. On the anniversary of my expulsion, I stood on the rooftop terrace of the Nexus Flow Tower. The wind whipped at my hair, but I didn't feel the cold. I looked down at the sprawling city of Seattle, a grid of lights glowing in the darkness. I held a glass of vintage wine in my hand. I inspected the liquid, watching it catch the light. This time, I had bought the bottle myself. I had uncorked it myself. There was no poison here, only the taste of victory. I raised the glass to the empty sky, to the girl who had been thrown out in the rain 5 years ago. "Happy graduation, Elena," I whispered. There was no forgiveness in my heart, and I was fine with that. Forgiveness was cheap. Justice was expensive, and I had paid the bill in full. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment down below and share your thoughts on Elena's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Mira Revenge Stories, like this video, and hit that hype button so we can share this journey with even more people.